Hello, everyone. Gong Hei Fat Choi, and a happy uh, Lunar New Year's to all of you. It is so good to see you all again. This is our first big event kicking off the new year for Get Connected. And what a glorious way to start. Just remembering last week's wonderful event with the inauguration of President and not First Lady, but our first Vice President, Kamala Harris, who represents the first woman, first Black and Asian woman ever in the history of the United States. And so tonight, as we kick off the Year of the Ox, we thought it was only fitting to celebrate Asian women, and as they take the lead and lead us to the top and make all of us so proud, whether women and people of color. And so tonight's program is focused on 5 amazing, distinguished Asian women who will inspire us and tell us all about how they made their way to the top in their respective fields. I would be remiss if I did not say a hearty thank you to NAP, the National Association of Asian American Professionals, Boston's chapter, who was our first ever affinity partner 13 years ago when my good friend Samson Lee and Leverett Wing were involved and still are today. They were the first people to say yes to our sponsorship and partnership with NAP. And we want to say thank you to GBH, who is not only a media partner for Get Connected, but a sponsor. And we are delighted to be partnering. And we have some great things we're going to be doing with GBH. So we won't share them tonight, but keep watching and keep listening. And I am also delighted to say that we have the fabulous Shirley Leon with us. She is the single most powerful, influential columnist in New England and been listed on the Boston Magazine and the GK 100. So I can't wait to see Shirley as she works her magic as a moderator. But for now, let me turn this over to Michael Dong, who is the president of NAP Boston. Michael?
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Colette. It is wonderful, and I'm honored to be a part of this celebration and also just our continuous partnership that we've had with Get Connected for so many years, as you've mentioned before. We are so proud of all the incredible panelists today. They exemplify strong Asian women who are not only willing to stand up for what is right, but be the role models we need for the next generation of women leaders. NAP Boston, for those of you who are unfamiliar with our organization, we are a volunteer nonprofit professional organization that promotes the career advancement and leadership development of Asian American professionals in all career fields. Our many programs and networking events cultivate and empower individuals to develop themselves professionally and personally. And at NAP Boston, we recognize the importance of women leadership in the Asian American community and have a committee dedicated to that called Women in NAP, or WIN. Our mission is to build leaders. Everything that we do is focused on helping a diverse group of professionals become better leaders in their careers and in the community. If you'd like to learn more about NAP Boston, you can visit our website at napboston.org. Thank you very much, Colette. Back to you.
Thank you very much. And I also would like to give a shout out to Leverett Wing of Commonwealth Seminar, an affinity partner, and Leverett is a member of the advisory board of Get Connected. And I also want to give a shout out to Michelle Wu, who I believe is in our audience. As you all know, Michelle is the first ever Asian woman to run for mayor of the city of Boston. And who knows, maybe she'll be the first woman of color or the second woman of color, but first Asian to be mayor of Boston. And I'm proud to say that Michelle is a mentee of mine. So go, Michelle. And now I will turn it over to the fabulous Shirley Leon.
Thank you, Colette. Thank you, Michael. Happy New Year to you and everyone. Gong hei fat soi and Xing Nian Kuai Le. That's all the Asian languages I know tonight. But anyways, I for one am delighted to see the Year of the Rat make way for the Year of the Ox. As someone who was born in the Year of the Rat, I want to apologize for 2020. All right. So tonight we're going to hear from 4 amazing Asian American women. But before I introduce each of them, I want to go over our format. The 5 of us will chat about the rise of Asian American for about half an hour, 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience. And at any point during the discussion, you can submit questions and do so under the Q&A tab, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So without further ado, here are tonight's panelists. First, I'm going to introduce Liz Cheng. She's a general manager. Hi, Liz. She's the general manager for television at GBH, overseeing its 7 Boston public media channels and the national nonfiction service World Channel, featuring 4 series she co-created and which have won an Emmy, Peabody, DuPont, Columbia, and many other awards honoring diversity. And prior to GBH, many of us remember Liz when she was Vice President and Director of Programming and Communication at ABC affiliate WCVB Channel 5. Hi, Liz. Next is Bina Venkataraman. She is the Boston Globe's editorial page editor. Hi, Bina. I haven't seen you in the office in a long time. Anyways, we've all been working from home like everyone else, but she is overseeing the editorial board as well as the opinion and ideas sections at the Globe. Prior to the Globe, she worked at the Broad Institute and she served as the climate change policy advisor in the Obama administration. She's going to tell us a little bit more about how she wore all those different hats and made those transitions. But she's also the author of the Optimist telescope, Thinking Ahead in a Reckless Age. Next is Linda Champion. Hi, Linda. Linda is an attorney, real estate broker, and former prosecutor who is now an assistant general counsel for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Department of Industrial Accidents, and she serves on the advisory board of GBH, Whittier Street Health Center, and Sierra Naturals. She's also a former candidate for the Suffolk County District Attorney. And finally, we have Tram Nguyen. She's a former legal aid attorney, and she's serving her 2nd term in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. She represents the 18th Essex District, which includes parts of Andover, Boxford, North Andover, and Tewksbury. She unseated a 4-term Republican in 2018 and is the first Vietnamese-American woman to serve in the legislature. So we have a really impressive group tonight. Hopefully, all right, we're going to start our conversation. So I'm going to start off with, Colette alluded to this, the inauguration day. And when you saw Kamala Harris take the oath on that day, what is the one word that captured how you felt at that moment? And Linda, I thought you could start us off because you're like Kamala, right? You're Black and you're Asian and you're on the rise. So tell us what was that one word and how did you feel that day?
So can you see I did, it was relief. I felt relieved. I mean, it's the only word that came to mind. I felt in that moment I could breathe.
Who wants to weigh in? Who wants to go next? Jump in, guys, girls.
I have to say, I was completely inspired because I never thought in my lifetime I would see such a thing. Never thought it.
I felt some pride. I don't know if I deserve to feel pride, but Kamala Harris's mother grew up in the same neighborhood of India. Her grandparents were the same neighborhood where my grandmother's from. So just a sense of pride.
And I agree with all those terms. And I was very enthusiastic for what is to come and what this means for, glasses shattered everywhere, just so much to look forward to. And I just can't imagine what it's like for the little girls and even big girls looking at someone who looks like them. And that's just really awe-inspiring.
Tram, let's pick up on that thought. I mean, when we have Kamala now, I think she's the most powerful woman in government, right, in the country right now. First woman of Black and South Asian descent to hold this position of vice president. So how will this make a difference for women of color, beyond just, seeing her take the oath?
Well, I mean, it will absolutely make a difference. She is breaking the mold, and it's going to be she is a trailblazer for all women of color. And I'm really hopeful that the Biden and Harris administration will also ensure that this progress, it's not just, for show, but that it would extend into policy and starting to address the vast racial disparities in our country. And we have a lot of work to do. And actually, I was really excited today to see that that President Biden has signed an executive order to address the racism against API communities that has started with such hateful words such as the China virus, the Kung flu, and other really just terrible terms that are race baiting. And now it just, like someone said earlier, I feel relieved that we have an administration that cares about the people. And I know that, Vice President Harris is certainly up to the challenge, and I'm excited to see her succeed.
Liz, is it easier for me to, Liz, do you want to jump in here?
Absolutely. I think about, as I said, I never thought in my lifetime I would see this. And, so many times when many of us, and not just me, oftentimes have been the only, right? The only woman, the only person of color, the youngest person in the room constantly. And you think, this is so hard. How is it that that anyone can sort of make it in so many tough businesses and make it to the top? And so many people have said, not only because women trying to shatter that glass ceiling, but also Asians trying to, it's a terrible term, but the bamboo ceiling, that there's a double whammy. And if you're younger, and many of us look younger than we are, it makes it even more difficult because people feel that you're not seasoned. And for young women across the country, and for the rest of us who are more seasoned, it gives hope that there is progress, and that there's a change in attitude, and that really that young little girl can do anything. She can become vice president, and then hopefully can become president.
So Shirley, I was going to say that one of the things President Barack Obama said about biracial children, because I think the experience to being biracial, particularly Black Asian, is a very different experience that many people might not understand. Barack Obama said, you find this area where you straddle. And she makes a difference for me because not only has she been able to straddle all these years living in different communities, right? But she understands the feeling of belonging that a Black Asian person wants. And you don't quite fit, and so you're sort of in this third space. And then we're left there to define what that space looks and is supposed to feel like for us.
So I want to transition a little bit to talking about Boston politics. And, we heard a little bit about what's going on. Marty Walsh is going to head to Washington to serve as the Biden's labor secretary. Looks like that's, going to happen. And the race to fill his shoes is heating up. And arguably women of color are the candidates to watch. Michelle Wu, Andrea Campbell, Kim Janey, who is in line to serve as acting mayor. And so is Boston ready to elect a woman of color? I mean, what will it take for the glass ceiling in City Hall to be broken? You know, is Bina there? Bina, do you feel comfortable starting us off? I think a lot of people want to hear from you.
It suddenly became such an exciting mayoral race. You know, it was going to probably be exciting anyway, but with Marty Walsh going to become labor secretary, I think, you know, it's like the gates are open and we're waiting to see who floods in. But I think having, you know, Andrea Campbell and Michelle Wu having declared early their candidacies for mayor makes a difference. Obviously, they're each racking up endorsements. And then the fact that Kim Janey will probably very soon be the acting mayor, it sort of breaks that ceiling a little bit just automatically by virtue of the process. So I think there is something to needing to be able to imagine people in these roles before we can actually do it. There are certain people who have trouble imagining women of color in leadership roles. And for that, you know, one thing that's been helpful even in that is just in terms of culture, right? The way that media, fictional Hollywood has helped put and elevate different kinds of people into leadership positions before that's happened in reality. I think, you know, there have been women presidents in all kinds of different contexts in Hollywood, and we still haven't had one here in the US. So I think that Kim Janey serving as acting mayor, which is likely to happen, will do something already to sort of signal. And then I think looking back at the, you know, city council elections that happened in Boston just a few years ago, that you can see the demographic change. You can see that people want leaders of different kinds, diverse leaders who will champion different kinds of causes, social justice causes in city council. Now, does that translate into what they want in the sort of executive of the city? We'll see, but I mean, it certainly seems to me that if you look at it in the context of Kamala Harris' election to vice president, that this tide is turning, and that Boston, as a progressive city, as a city that you know, is attracting young people, there's no reason why Boston can't elect a woman of color into this role that has been traditionally a guy's game.
Linda, I know you have something to say on this, right? You're a student of Boston politics.
A little bit. I mean, I think that Boston is ready for a woman if that's who they pick. But I think that the issue is there's no real way to lead in uncertain waters, right? So one of the things I think we should be looking for is someone who can bring everyone back together. So unity is first and foremost in my mind. How we can sustain what Boston has built so far, because I think everyone can just look around. The city's growing. It's not the city that I moved to back in the early 90s. And you want to make sure that we also have someone who can grow us and move us forward. And I think that that's going to take a candidate, a leader who's not afraid to lead, but who can lead, including everyone. And I think that women, it's our time. So, you know, you said the year of the rat, the year of the rat, you tear everything down. I'm born the year of the ox. The year of the ox, you build it all back up, right? So you move it forward. And I think that it speaks volumes that a woman of color like a Michelle Wu, like an Andrea Campbell, like a Kim Janey, that any woman would be willing to put themselves in that vulnerable position to agree to step up, to offer to lead, and to be willing to run for that seat. So I think it's going to be an amazing year for everyone to be watching Boston politics.
Yeah, I started to wonder if any man dares to jump into the race, right? It might be all women dominating the field. Wouldn't that be really exciting? You know, Liz mentioned this, alluded to this earlier, kind of how women of color face a double whammy of discrimination, being a woman and a person of color. And I'm sure all of you have experienced this to some extent where, you know, I think women of color, we tend to look younger than we are. And as a result, you know, society and organizations don't set high expectations and for us. And so I was just wondering if you felt this unconscious bias and how have you dealt with it? Maybe you could give people tips on or share an anecdote where you address this head on. And Tram, I know this happened to you when in your first term on Beacon Hill. Maybe you could start off with what happened to you.
Yeah, certainly. I'm not sure how many people remember the Boston Globe article from 2019. It was just a couple of weeks into my first term. And for those who don't know, when you're first in there, you're not assigned an office right away. You're put in what is called a bullpen with all the new legislators. And so you're seated, one after the other, and then next to you is one aide. And so one day a lobbyist came in looking for, Representative so-and-so, and turned to me and said, "Oh, do you know where Representative so-and-so is?" And I said, "No." And then he saw that there was a sign in front of my table that said, Representative Nguyen. And then so he said, "Well, do you know where Representative Nguyen is?" And I said, "No, well, actually, no." He turned to my aide and said, "Are you Representative Nguyen?" And to time, my aide is a male, of course. So turned to him and said, as that, and just completely skipped over me. And I think that is just so indicative of exactly how certain people view what an elected official is. And, I'd like to say that there's nothing wrong with being identified as an aide. And in fact, I like to say that my aide knows more than I do of the ongoings of the State House. But the fact that he couldn't fathom that I could ever be the representative is the harmful aspect of this. There's a persistent and harmful ideal of what a representative should look like. And that's what's discouraging women from running. And it perpetuates this outdated notion that some legislators should be taken seriously and some shouldn't. And I believe that representatives should and can and should come from everywhere in the state, because it only makes the legislature better. I like to say that diversity is a value in and of itself, because it allows for innovation and forces us to think outside the box. And it also allows us to write laws that encompasses everyone's experiences and create policy that works for the entire Commonwealth. And for me, as someone I was an attorney prior to getting into office and worked in legal services, the same thing happened. Whenever I went to court, they would ask me if I were the interpreter or, the paralegal or a student, but not the attorney representing people with really big problems to deal with. And so how I deal with that is that you overwork and you prove them wrong, and it's about building relationships. But that's the issue, is that we have to work a lot harder to earn that trust and to earn that respect that, is not automatically given, whereas that could be automatically given to certain others who they think should be in elected office. And that's why we need to stand in solidarity and elect more women of color and women generally, so that it's a norm and it's not something out of the ordinary.
Liz, you have a story too, right?
Well, I have, I've told this story before, but early in my career, I was in another city. And I had just finished I was a print reporter, and then I went on to be a broadcast reporter. And I was interviewing the head of an adult correctional institution, a big prison. And I walked in, and I had, two white, a camera person and an audio person. I had a suit on. I had a notebook that said reporter on it. And so I went in and I introduced myself to this director of the prison. And I said, "Hi, I'm Liz Cheng. I'm from blah, blah, blah." And he looked at me and said, "Can you get me a cup of coffee?" And I said, and I was taken aback, and I said, "Sure, where is this coffee and how would you like it?" And I could feel the cameraman and the audio guy step back, and they're like, "Oh my God, this feminist is going to blow and he's going to be very sorry." But I very sweetly got him his coffee. And I put it down in front of him, and I sat down, and he said, "So when is the reporter arriving?" And I looked at him, I said, "I am the reporter." And so from then on, I didn't have to say anything. And I said, "I don't have a court order, but I would like to see these following files." And he's like, no problem. You can see whatever you want." And I knew that every other line was like, "Please don't call me out as a racist, a sexist, an ageist." And after he delivered the files, he said, "A reporter in my tenure has never been in maximum security. Would you like to go?" I said, "Yes, I would." So, it was, I used the fact that he was shocked and certainly dismayed, and to be able to get the story that I wanted to get. And I used that, but it did teach me something that, that as a reporter, I felt as if I had to be the sharpest tool in the box, right? So I had to be overly aggressive. I had, and to be, which is really not my nature. My nature is to try and ferret out the story, the kind of story that perhaps other people couldn't get. So I shortly after that, I decided that I wanted to be a producer, an executive producer, and take myself off the air because, at the time, if I was to look at this, I looked like I was 12. I looked like the intern. I looked like someone, and to constantly be, in that situation where you constantly have to prove yourself. And I thought, how much better to be able to control others and to control the narrative and the questions and the stories in a way that that I would feel more comfortable. But that I'm sure that person never did this again to another Asian reporter.
That was a life-changing cup of coffee, right? That's an amazing story.
Yeah, I think if I had gotten angry and done, then it would have been like I would have been on the defensive because I acted poorly. So I, just decided to be the better person.
And you got the story, right? You got a really good story out of it. Bina or Linda, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, that reminded me of two things I could say, both of those stories. So when I was working in the Obama White House, there was a meeting that I had to lead once where I was trying to get different people to come to an agreement about a project. And so I was working in climate policy. It was a bunch of white men, all over 40. This was about 7 years ago. So I'm in my 30s. So I lead this meeting and I'm wearing that day a bright kind of fuchsia reddish, almost like Sergeant Pepper inspired blazer. And I probably had, like, you can't tell now because I'm at home, like wearing a sweater, but I probably had a little bit of outlandish fashion for government service. But so this meeting is hard and intractable. And as soon as it finishes, I'm feeling really good because we got agreement on the thing I wanted us to agree on. And so I'm just having this like little moment of high. And one of the guys who's been sitting around the table comes up to me like he's going to tell me something afterwards. And I'm expecting, like, I don't know, what was going on, how deluded I was. I was expecting to be like, great job leading the meeting. And instead he's like, Michael Jackson called and he wants his jacket back. That was his one quip to me. And of course it was meant to sort of like take me down a notch, or just maybe he was being funny. And I just sort of, my comeback was, I'll take that as a compliment, and then kind of moved on. But I think it was, it's an example of something that's not like clearly, so clearly rude or out of, right? Like it's not so out there that you would be like, I got to go to HR. And, you're in the Obama administration, you're all trying to do sort of progressive things, generally agree about the direction of, what should be done about the environment, what should be done about the planet, people's health. But it's the kind of thing that's undermining, right? And it suggests to you that you weren't being viewed for your ideas and what you brought to the table and how you carried yourself and the outcome of that. You were being still viewed from a very external perspective, which of course is looking even younger than you were, having a higher pitched voice, being the only woman at the table, but, ostensibly leading the meeting. So yeah, that just came to mind in thinking about in Representative Nguyen's story too, just what are people willing to see you as versus what you actually are? And there is this gap where you might see yourself, but you get reminded, right, and these sort of marks along your career, I think have to be managed in a way where you remind yourself, yeah, I actually do still deserve to be in this room. I did actually achieve that outcome, or I got that story. And I will say Liz's encounter is so much more vivid than anything I can bring to mind right now, but it does remind me that being underestimated as a journalist, which surely I would love to hear if you have a story about this, is just such a wonderful, wonderful thing. Sometimes people will tell you things that they really shouldn't tell you because they think you're just this little girl who's not going to write anything about them that could be potentially critical. And so I will just say that you can always, there are these ways to use these points of bias in society to your advantage. It doesn't erase the fact that the bias is net negative for us as a society and for us as individuals, but there are ways to sort of leverage that and sort of pivot from it that I think are important to learn. And they're kind of survival tactics for us.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that all of those stories, I mean, all of us as women, just never mind a woman of color, all of us can think of those stories where someone made a pass at us or said something inappropriate. And, you know, and I remember being a single mother and finishing law school and being pregnant and going into a meeting with a bunch of white men and women and everyone giggling. And someone said, do all Black people have babies without being married? You know, it's these kinds of things, right? But recently, I remember applying for a volunteer position. And if you say that being a woman of color is a double whammy, then being a Black Asian woman of color is a triple whammy. Because I went to a meeting and I was super excited about this opportunity. And one of the questions right out the gate was, what have you ever contributed to the Asian community? And it almost floored me. And so I think bias, you know, people really have to understand. And so one of the things Vice President Kamala Harris is going to do is she's going to get people to stop straddling and get people to really understand all these forms of discrimination and racism and bias that impact each and every one of us in a different way, and sometimes in very intimate ways. And so for someone to approach me, having been raised by a woman from South Korea, and in an interview asked me, what is my contribution to Asian people? It is almost insulting. So there are all these ways that implicit bias and racism impact our life, but I think as women of color, particularly when we're women, we're Asian and we're Black, we get it from every single side.
Linda, wait, you raised such an important point because, you know, how many times all of us have been in a room, and if you're the only Asian in the room, you're expected to not only represent, you know, I'm from Chinese heritage, you know, Chinese, but every other APA heritage out there. You know, it's like, you know, I'm not speaking for all Chinese people. I'm certainly not going to speak for Thai people, for South Asian people, for Indian people, for Koreans, for anyone else. But yet you're expected to be able to sort of, this big melting pot of Asian Americans out there, and we're all supposed to know each other and understand and be able to represent. And that's really, you know, unfair to everyone. And, you know, it's so often that, you know, people talk about, you know, rules and regulations in which, you know, depending on when you came to this country or when your parents came to this country, it's completely different. Your experience in America is completely different. So never mind, you know, coming from a different country. So, you know, being able to convey that to people and let people know that there's a huge difference, and, you know, it behooves folks to understand and school themselves about this rather than expecting, you know, their Asian friend to teach them about all of Asia. It's just not fair.
You raised such a great point, and I cannot help but put in a plug. I'm sure you all know the legislature, we've been working very hard on the disaggregated data bill, and that is exactly why it is so important, because our immigration histories and when and where we came from really determines so much. And given the pandemic this past year, it's especially important to see, you know, how public health affects different communities differently. And so it is just so crucial for us to keep all that in mind and realize just like, you know, the differences that also, but the similarities too, to, you know, like Linda was saying, unity and solidarity and all of that's important, but also really focusing on the differences and how we could work and adjust those.
Tram, that bill in the legislature, it's languished, right? I mean, this is not the first time it's been filed. So what's the holdup?
So, I mean, we've had a lot of opposition from various groups, and to deal with that. And to be frank, this past year was the entire focus is on COVID, and you know we needed to work to increase the health and safety of the people. And the Asian Caucus that I'm a part of, and I'm so happy that we've now increased to 9 members versus 6 last time around, and now we have 4 women of color. So it's exciting to start this new session to work on that. But you're right. So even before I was an elected elected office, I worked on this as an advocate, as an attorney for the Boston Legal Services and many advocacy groups. And I'm sure you remember the hearing from 2017 with hundreds and hundreds of people coming in opposition. And so, I have to say, kudos to Chair Taki Chan. He addressed many of the concerns. And so we're very hopeful that this time, we'll get the momentum to get it going.
So I want to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID on women of color. Women have been laid off at a higher rate during the pandemic compared to, the rest of the population. And because there's a lot of women working in hospitality and the restaurant industries, and those have been the hardest hit sectors. There was a McKinsey study late last year that found that Black women in particular are suffering during the pandemic. They are suffering not only from the heavy emotional toll of last year's racial strife, but also, they are they're like twice as likely as women overall to say the death of a loved one has been one of their biggest challenges during the pandemic. So I was wondering if the four of you can talk about what can organizations and government do to ensure women of color don't get left behind when the pandemic is over.
So since the representative is on the line, I'd just like to say that for the small business owners, particularly the ones that may not have their paperwork in order, right? So let's just face it, mom and pop shops, they don't spend time doing paperwork. When the pandemic hit, when the CARES Act funds were released, all of these things were released in stages. So it was phase 1 or stage 1 or this round of funding. People in the community don't often understand the different rounds of funding, but more importantly, the paperwork in and of itself was complicated. And that is simply unfair. So when people were screaming and hollering about the big businesses getting all the money, it wasn't that the small businesses didn't need it. They didn't know how to apply. They didn't understand the process. And so we have to do a better job of getting people to understand how to fill out the paperwork. The government was essentially shut down for the most part. So where were they going to go? But I will tell you one of the things they did. When the mayor made a call in the city of Boston and said, we are short PPE, almost every single Vietnamese business owner that I knew that had access to PPE packed it up, boxed it up, and got it to the hospitals and dropped it off where it was supposed to be. They didn't ask questions. They didn't ask for money. They didn't ask how they were going to be compensated. They didn't ask when they were going to be able to open their businesses, if they would need that stuff. They pulled together thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of PPE. And it was sad to me that they were then calling and saying, does anyone know when we can reopen? Does anyone know where we can get the supplies? Does anyone know how we go about getting the plexiglass? And so I felt for a community that had just given so much, had asked for nothing, the least we could do is make sure they have the information that they need.
Tram, do you want to talk a little bit about what the legislature has been doing to help small businesses? I know it's been a focus of Governor Baker, and certainly I'm sure the members there are talking to constituents and dealing with this all the time.
No, absolutely. And Linda raised a great point. I think language access is definitely something that we need to certainly increase. And with the CARES Act too, I mean, that was administered by the federal government, as you can imagine. So what I did was we were able to collaborate with the Small Business Association to have certain briefings in different languages, but that was not enough because all the different forms should have been in different languages. And this is not just with the small businesses. This is with the unemployment system. This is with the vaccination rollout. We have to make sure that people have access to the information. It's not enough to just put it out there. And so, yeah, I completely agree with you, Linda. That's certainly something that we will need to continue to work on. But in terms of talking about, the state's response to the pandemic, I think equity has to be at the center of public policy going forward. And that really starts with the vaccination rollout and making sure that community communities that are hit hardest have access and know that help is on the way. And that also means we need to talk about putting in mass vaccination sites in minority neighborhoods of Boston. You know, as Linda was saying, as someone who is from the Vietnamese-American community, but I don't, I represent the suburbs now, but I have been talking to, friends and family who are in the community, and really there's just a dearth of information. And I think this goes across the board for our immigrant communities and communities of color across the state, and want to make sure that they have access. But beyond what we know, COVID has really exacerbated existing inequalities and structural racism within the healthcare system, right? And so we just need to work to really focus on that and focus on where the gaps are. And in terms of small businesses, one bill that I'm particularly supportive that just came out this past week, I think, and sponsored by Senators Lester and Lewis, we've realized that in talking about the PPP loan forgiveness amounts, long story short, essentially the tax code would allow for business that have been incorporated to not count that as income, but because of the way the Massachusetts tax laws don't couple 100% with federal law, unincorporated businesses, including moms and pops stores, mostly owned by minority owned and women owned, would have those the loan forgiveness counted as income. And we need to have that fixed right away so that certain small businesses would not just face this extraordinary increase in taxes at the end of the year. And of course, during the start of the pandemic, we also had the state awarded over $50 million in grants to small businesses and prioritized places owned by women and people of color. And I think based on the numbers I saw, 95% of the businesses who received the grant were minority owned and 76 were owned by women. So I think that's progress, and that's what we need to continue to do, is be intentional about making sure that these grants get to the people who need them most.
And I so agree with Tram and with Linda. The underpinnings of all of this is a sort of systemic sexism is the only way I can describe it, because women have been historically underpaid. And I was just, as we were talking, I just Googled the latest amount in Massachusetts. And if white men make $1, white women make 70 cents on the dollar. Asian women make 67 cents on the dollar. Black women make 49 cents on the dollar. Hispanic women make 45 cents on the dollar. And when you have a woman who's a head of a household, that means that when the pandemic hits, you don't have a huge savings account. You don't have, a lot of pad. You don't have the kind of pad that you need to make sure that you and your family don't become homeless. So the fact that this systemic problem has been in existence and is still intractable it sort of hits everything. So when something like COVID comes along, it just makes things so much worse.
I couldn't agree more with all of these diagnoses of the problem. I think I would just add to the mix. Well, first, a consideration of the scope and scale of this, the amount of unemployment we have, the amount of burden that has been put on women of color, on women in general, but then also on women of color in particular, and how that might affect them permanently. There are ways in which women are falling back in the workforce in terms of women's mobility and women's ability to take those next career steps, because women tend to do more caregiving. And so there's a lot of caregiving of the old and a lot of caregiving of the young, obviously with school closures and things like that to think about. And the fact that there is such a great amount of this kind of hardship, in addition to the closures of locally owned businesses, is something that I think the state programs are excellent. I don't want to say, I think it's great that they've prioritized these local businesses, but the kind of spending that's going to be needed, it really needs to be more federal stimulus, helping states, that can't run deficits, to be able to fund these kinds of programs. And I think it goes to, one of the early problems with the PPP loans that were going to help businesses, that were intended to help small businesses, at least on paper, is that the banks that were brokering those initial loans were privileging their clients that had much bigger businesses. And so I think there is a whole part of this in terms of the solution to the problem that has to involve financial institutions in a much more serious way. And perhaps the next round of stimulus funding needs to look not just at the loans going directly to the businesses, but at the kind of community organizations and nonprofits that can support women and business owners of color at the local level to get their paperwork in order to get those loans, in order to get that financing that they need, or the loan forgiveness, whatever it might be that is going to be there. And then I think, it's just some of the ways that we think about in this country, we are so far behind other developed countries in terms of how we support caregiving of children, of the elderly. As a non-parent, I see, in women who are caring for children or caring for aging parents right now, just, what an impact that can make on their careers and what an impact they can make on their lives, on the psychological burden of that. And I think we shouldn't be so averse in this country to figuring out how do we provide funded childcare the way Germany does, for example. I think we need to start having those conversations in a much more serious way than we've ever had them in the past. And hopefully having women in more leadership positions in our government will help with that.
So I have more questions, but I want to get to some of the audience questions, and then we can go back to some of my other questions, and maybe hopefully I can encourage even more questions from the audience. So the first question I want to ask is that in Boston, this is perhaps a question for Linda, how would you characterize the relationship between Blacks and Asians?
So for me, it's interesting because 10 years ago, we started a program with Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center. It was originally created because as a child, and I don't know if anyone ever watches football, but Hines Ward, who is half Korean, half Black, an American football player, was born in Korea, and he talks about his experience growing up in South Korea and then coming to the United States. One of the things that happened because Korea, there was the Korean War, and then there was also the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War is where my father met my mother. But there's over 30,000 Black Asian children sort of scattered and living in Korea. And they were unrecognized, even though it was their birthright. They were born there, they spoke the language. Everything about them was Korean except for the color of their skin. And it was only recently that the Korean government started to make changes to recognize those children and to give them the citizenship that they deserved. So they were sort of abandoned by their American fathers and then, not accepted by the Korean community, right? So we thought, let's be proactive. And this is 10 years ago. We worked with Giles Lee over at Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center with some other people. And we built a music room because we felt that music was the way. It's a common thing where everybody loves it. And we can bring people together. We could bring children of color from Roxbury or Dorchester or any of the surrounding areas for free together to work together within the Chinese American community so that we could start to break down barriers. Sometimes that's easy to do, sometimes it's not. But what I learned through just watching my mother and the things she would say as I was a child growing up, some of this is learned behaviors, right? So my mom felt that when she looked, white people seemed to have an easy time in America, but Black people seem to have a hard time in America. So her motto in philosophy was always, don't be with the Black people because then you're going to struggle. You got to go and be with the white people so you can survive, because everything for an immigrant coming to a new country is about survival. So my position is, if people stop pitting the communities against each other, right? Stop pointing out all the things that we've done wrong in the past. I got it. We've done some things wrong. We haven't been perfect, okay? It's an imperfect world. But there are a lot of things that we've done right. And there are a lot of opportunities that we can create for each other within the Korean community, Asian community, whatever, aspect of the Asian community you identify with, and the Black community, where we can bring people together and really do some good. And we showed that through working with Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center. The kids loved it. We loved it. Everybody enjoyed that experience. But it really takes people to be the bridge, right? Who's the bridge in the communities? Instead of saying what everyone does wrong, who is that next leader that will bring us all together and show all the things that are common about us, all the things that we do love to share together, and are excited about that to lead us forward. So that's sort of my position about what's happening with the Asian American community and the Black community in Boston. And I think that sort of race piece is really more indicative of the older generations. I find the younger kids, the younger generations, they're not having all that. They love each other. They want unity. They want equality. And they've proven that to us by taking to the streets and protesting.
Anyone else? Can I add something? So I was going to say, it's interesting. I have to say, as someone who I deal with, talk to a lot of people in town, I have to say, I find that as an Asian American journalist, an Asian American woman, I feel like I have a lot of Black allies in town, and maybe it's because it's it has been a traditionally white male dominated town. So I feel like the Black and the Asians, we actually come together. I mean, that's why I know Colette pretty well, and I know some others too. And some of my best sources are in the Black community. So I from the perspective of reporting, I consider the Black community allies, and so it's been great from my point of view. So I want to get through some more questions. So one is, can you recommend some books that have been inspirational for you as an Asian American woman of influence?
Well, I'm actually right in the middle of reading Joy Luck Club again, because I read this when I was in middle school. And we were, during quarantine, what else are you going to do? You go through all the Netflix and Hulu and Amazon. And I started seeing that movie again. And so I started reading it. But, and Representative Maria Robinson would love this. This past summer, started a list of, books by Asian American authors. And so we're trying to go through them. And so I'd be happy to share that with folks. But just reading books and learning about reading about the experiences that are so similar to yours, it has really helped me to get through this pandemic. And of course, Tram Nguyen is a friend of mine. And so his books, he has some new ones coming out, and it's been inspirational to hear some of his work too. So those are my recommendations for now.
Well, as a writer, I've been, when Arundhati Roy came out with The God of Small Things, her novel, which was so beautiful, and not about, being a leader, but really a story of a family in South India, that certainly inspired me. But it's also what she did afterwards, which she really became sort of a writer activist and sort of wedding public service to her writing and her writerly and literary sensibilities. So I have taken inspiration from her. But I would say so many women, and not necessarily through their books, but even just how they've used their voices, thinking about Toni Morrison and how she used her voice as a writer, the way she championed other writers. So there's been a mix, and some of it maps onto like specific books, but a lot of it's about the personalities and the people that have really come before and blazed the trail.
For me, it's about female and Asian women filmmakers, in which there are quite a few. I mean, there's certainly Grace Lee, and and most recently we had on PBS the Asian Americans, where there were just a slew of our fellow Asian American filmmakers who are not only illustrating the stories and the history here in America, but also talking about those women who really made a huge difference for folks in terms of trying to help out, at turn of the century and all and other time periods, and standing up for causes and all of the above. So, for me, it's all these great female Asian American filmmakers who have come forward to tell those stories, which otherwise would be undiscovered.
Can I also just say I'm really inspired by Awkwafina's performances since we're expanding the genre from books. There's something about the way she's so unbridled and so herself and so, maybe against stereotype. I don't know if that's even comes into her thinking about her comedy. I should see more about how she thinks about it. But I find that really inspiring to see someone so bold as an Asian American.
So I'm going to ask one more question from the audience, and we'll go back to the other questions we had talked about earlier. So let's see. This question says, many thanks for creating the space for discussion, and thanks so much to the speakers for their contributions to the dialogue. How can we increase the number of AAPI women in leadership and executive positions across organizations, institutions, and sectors? And what can we do as individuals to empower ourselves and build political power?
So I'll start. I mean, number one, we have to make sure that, as leaders, that pay and benefits for all, most especially women, are fair and equitable. That when you come into an organization, even if there are disparities, that you need to do what you need to do. And I know in terms of GBH, we're hiring a new chief diversity officer. We are empowering, we're creating a diversity council. We are empowering those affinity groups that are already out there at GBH and empowering them to help make change to increase diversity, with metrics, tactics, resources, expectations to make sure that the talent prospect pools are as diverse as possible. To increase inclusion, we are offering regular seminars and outside experts to examine, everything from implicit bias, systemic racism, microaggressions, which I've seen in the chat, and really the history of, of Black, Indigenous, people of color, so that, so that we as people of color don't constantly have to school other people. And we're also telling every individual at GBH that they have to have a diversity goal, that they have to have DEI goal in when they do their goals for the year of what they'd like to see happen. What is their personal goal? Either to school themselves, to learn about the history of systemic racism, or whatever it is, so that this is something that it's not a mantle that they put on when they come to work, and then when they go home, they take it off. That this is something that has to change people, because as we know, you have to work hard not to be racist. You have to work hard not to have implicit bias. It's not something that just because you've never done anything doesn't mean that you are an anti-racist. That's couldn't be farthest from the truth. And then also just to constantly be open to change. We've changed the holidays. Columbus Day is now Indigenous Peoples Day. Juneteenth is going to be a holiday. All those kinds of things. When I went in all of our in all of our signatures, we have pronouns, we have the tribal lands that we're coming from. So to constant in everything we do, we need to make sure and understand that there's diversity and that it's appreciated and it's celebrated, not just tolerated.
So I just want to jump in. So I just believe that you can't be what you can't see. And so for all of us, and the panelists, every single person listening, if you guys are working in spaces, no matter whether you feel that you're a person of influence in that space or not, you can't be what you can't see. And so it's your job. You have the ability to bring people into those spaces where other people would not ordinarily see them. You have somebody that you can mentor, you have someone that you can check in on, and you can give them information or offer them programs like the one you're sitting in today. You can't be what you can't see, and we all have to remember that. And if we're the only one in that space, something's wrong. We should not tolerate that. We have to hold other people accountable to say, look, there are other people who look just like me that are just as competent, just as qualified, just as capable, and we have to create those opportunities.
I can't agree more. Opportunities and access to resources are really key to making sure that we bring people into the doors, right? And so, you know, as someone who, like I said, I'm like now still one of only 4 women of color in the legislature. And why is that? Why aren't more, you know, Asian American women considering running for office? And that's, we realize it's because when you look at staffers, when you look at interns, like what do they look like? Because that's the entry point into these positions. And so we've been thinking through of why is it that Asian Americans aren't applying? Many of them are from low income communities. They can't afford to have an unpaid internship. So we need to figure out a way to work with schools or work in to get funding to allow them to have that. And that's why I want to give a shout out to an organization like the Asian American Women's Political Initiative. They're very intentional about bringing in Asian American women, or the Commonwealth Seminar, like what Leverard's doing. He's training people to be activists in our community. And that's what we need. We need to continue to invest in these organizations that are allowing people whose voices have not been heard to be heard. And also people like myself and others, we are always trying to do outreach and talking to folks in the community to let them know what it is like to be in elected office. What do you need to think about? And, you know, you're more prepared than you think you are. And that's what the message we want to send out to folks, that, you know, just take that leap of faith and reach out to others who you are curious about their position, and learn about those positions and see yourself in those positions.
I would just say 2 things. I love all of these points, but one is that it's part of the way I think about it is trying to give access to the networks that I have eventually built myself access to for other women of color, for other young journalists of color, men and women, and non-gender conforming, and to really think about that in a way that is not about charity, but to think about it as a way that's actually strengthening my industry. And actually, in a way, I think it's educating me too, because mentorship happens in 2 directions. So being able to increase that access for people, and sometimes it means actively going after people for recruiting them. So I found, in particular with journalists of color, that it can help to actually reach out to them directly and tell them why you value them and why you value their work, because the barriers that have been set up, the sort of way that they look at old school journalistic institutions, news organizations, might keep them from ever applying, or keep them from ever wanting to walk in that door, thinking it's a place where they could have a sense of belonging. Because it's not just, you know, that you want them to apply or you want them to see the opportunity as important, but you want to be clear what kind of culture you would support them with once they come on board and once they join your organization. And so that really goes to the second point, which is about creating an inclusive culture, which I think all the things that Liz mentioned are things that, as you know, Shirley, we're working on in the Globe with an Inclusion Council, really working on, you know, what we do with respect to our audiences, how we cover communities of color, how we create inclusion and better ability for journalists within the newsroom who are journalists of color to move up the ranks. So all of that is super important. But I also think, you know, because I run an editorial board where we deliberate, a lot of what I think about are those subtle, you know, cues. How do people get shut down in different kinds of conversations? Who gets shut down earlier? How do you create an atmosphere where everyone feels comfortable disagreeing vehemently, because we need to debate to create better ideas and figure out, refine what we're going to do. But that disagreement happens in a way where we acknowledge each other's humanity and where the fundamental principle of everyone belonging is always upheld. And I think that's something that, you know, is a work in progress. It's really hard to do, but it's so critically important. And I think people overlook it a lot. You know, they think that they get one of each, or they get, you know, someone who looks like this, someone who looks like that. And now they have a diverse team, and now the box is checked. But you have to help people thrive in that environment. You have to help each person's voice be heard. And I think it's often important to have more than one. Have 2, have 3, because then you unleash something different in terms of your culture being able to change.
Great. So I want to follow up something that Tram was talking about, you know, encouraging Asian American women to run for hours or to envision themselves in office. And I was wondering, what drove you? What made you think, you know what, I should run for office and I'm going to challenge this 4-term incumbent, and I think I can beat him? Like, what went through your mind?
Wow. So I have to be the first to say I never thought I was going to run for office ever. I enjoyed my job as an attorney. I loved the work that I did. But what really motivated me was I tried to reach out to my legislator for 2 years and he never got back to me. So in my mind, I'm like, no Asian American woman would ever let this happen. And so as someone who has been an advocate working on policy and thinking through of how those policies affect real life people on the ground, I tried to work with my legislator at the time, and it was very clear that he had no understanding of how these policies impact the most vulnerable communities. And I think that that is exactly why diversity is a value in and of itself, because from my experiences, from my background, I came here as a political refugee with my family when I was 5 years old. We were on food stamps. We lived in public housing. I was the first in my family to go to college or graduate from college. And all that means something, and all that impacts the policy, the type of things that I prioritize in my work, right? And so what really motivated me to run and to finally take that leap of faith is to have a really supportive group of people around me and reminding me that I can do this. Because as I started saying earlier, a lot of us have a lot of doubts because we put a lot of pressures on ourselves and we think that you need to know everything before you actually take action. And that's not true, because I don't think a white man does that. They don't question their ability, and we need to start thinking that way. And how do we help each other get there so that we have the confidence and the support and the resources that we need? And to be frank, I admire people who have been in office before me, like Michelle Wu, like Lydia Edwards. These are folks, my friends, who have been in office, and I've seen them in office, and you need to see it to believe it. We have to keep saying that. And when there are more and more of us, more of Asian American women will run. And so we need to continue to build on that. I'm excited to be a part of that.
Great. So when I introduced Bina, I alluded to this, that you're going to give us some advice here, some career advice to folks in the audience. The pandemic has been about a lot of us are pivoting or thinking about pivoting. And I was wondering if you found success in journalism, in academia, and government. So what advice do you give to women who want to transition from one field to another?
So none of my transitions were particularly well plotted out. So I've been the kind of person who, is driving down the highway, and if I see an interesting exit, I take that exit, and I have things that I care about. And as long as the exit allows me to do and work on the things I care about, then, I consider whether it's worth taking, and, often have taken it. So that's why my career has involved chapters in the different sectors. And I would say that just wherever you are, in whatever job you're in or whatever sector you're in, develop skills that are transferable and versatile. And I think the ability to write and communicate effectively a spoken and written language, the ability to work within a team collaboratively to make something happen. That's a real skill to cultivate, talent to cultivate. The ability to think strategically, so not just about how to solve a problem in the immediate term, but really how you could see something evolving, whether that's a journalistic project, whether that's a policy, and what is the way you get from A to B, and who are the people that you need to bring along? What are the coalitions you need to bring along to get to that point? Those are kind of transferable skills. I do think that journalists, it's interesting because my previous chapter in journalism was over a decade ago, and then I kind of came back to it. And what's interesting is that it wasn't so hard to move from being a journalist into the world of policy because journalists are trained to ask questions and to just really try to drill down and understand what's going on. And so I think that if you can hone that skill to not be afraid to ask what might seem like naive questions, but to really ask the critical questions, I think some of the best people in government, the best thinkers in academia, are the ones who ask the sort of maybe obvious but elusive question that no one else is asking, and that push people's thinking forward. So I think it's about cultivating some attitudes and skills that you can transfer, and then having your networks be diverse. So I think there's a tendency when we are in one field or one job to just focus on developing relationships in that field. But you should always be cultivating relationships and a network that is across different fields. If only because it makes life more interesting and your dinner parties will be more interesting, but also because that then gives you the ability to tap into a different job opportunity, or the ability to hear about things that you might not see yourself doing, to the point of, can you really imagine yourself doing something different? Well, if you're exposed to lots of different people doing that kind of work, you might start to see yourself in those roles.
Great. So we are fast running out of time. I have about 3 minutes left. So I want to go to like our one final last question before I hand it back to Colette. So I want to know, being on the eve of the Lunar New Year, I think I asked my mom, I think it's what, February 11th or 2 weeks. We still got a little more time until the Lunar New Year. But anyways, so any closing words of wisdom you'd like to share to celebrate the Lunar New Year, in the year of the ox? I don't know, Linda's the year of the ox. Maybe she's got some wisdom for us. Any advice to Kamala Harris, to the Biden administration? But just one last thought for our audience tonight. Maybe Linda could start.
I would just say that it's okay to fail. Like, go out there, knock it out the park, get a sledgehammer, just like Kamala Harris did, and just break that ceiling and just do what you got to do. And no one is ever going to fault you for trying. So everyone on this listening, go out, do something great for yourself. If not for yourself, for your community, just do something and don't have any fear. This is the year of the ox.
I would say two things. One, go out, find a mentor, be a mentor. It's so important to bring up the next generation of great people, great women of color, men of color. The next generation, you need to help bring them up and help them through, what probably is difficult times. And then the second thing is something I was moderating a discussion with former Governor Deval Patrick, and we were talking about diversity and all that. And I was talking about, once again, it's not something you take on when you go to work and then you take off when you go home. And he said something that was so profound. He said, Liz, at the end of the day, it's who's sitting at your dining room table. If they look like you need to branch out and you need to find the world and appreciate the world.
I'll say Chuk Mung Nung Mai to my friends. I lived in Hanoi, but I apologize for anything I butchered there to my Vietnamese-American friends. And I'm excited for the year of the ox, and for hopefully the ox to carry some of the burdens of the past year away from us. And I would just say, bring your whole self to everything that you do. I think so often people who grow up with different cultures, different races, different ways of identifying will try to leave some parts of themselves out of the mix. But this is really our time, and you can bring your full self to everything you do, and that will only make you better at what you do, and it will only open up the space for more people to bring their full selves to the table.
Bina, I love that you said that, because I also want to wish everyone Chúc mừng năm mới, since we've already heard the greeting in both Chinese and Korean earlier. And it's a very special time. And I think, like all of you are saying, it's a new year, new opportunities. We have a new administration. And the one thing I want to say is, we've all suffered a lot of losses this year, and, it shows us how fleeting life is. And so for us to just remember that life is short, take that leap, and surround yourself with good people, because I've always said that, if you have good people, a good foundation, you can leap, but you'll never fall. And so I hope that you all will do that. And I wish you a healthy and prosperous new year full of good fortune, and that we'll all get through this together. And I know we will.
Well, thank you, Liz. Thank you, Tram. Thank you, Bina. Thank you, Linda. I am going to pass this off to Colette, who's going to close us out. Colette, are you going to talk? Are you going to wait? We've spoken what? Chinese? Wait, Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese. Wait, do we do Korean?
Oh, I just assumed.
Linda should do Korean.
Linda, do you know?
Linda, do you know Korean?
Do you know,
No.
do you know
I thought
Korean?
you said that.
I don't know Korean. My Korean is so bad. My
Oh.
girlfriends call it Konglish. 미안해,
I'm
미안해,
married to a
언니.
Korean. I have half Korean children. I should know. I should know how to say Happy New Year. I'm sorry. I'll follow up next year. Anyways, next year we'll learn all the different languages, how to say Happy New Year.
No,
Anyway,
Michael knows. I think I want to hear him say it.
Yeah, I'm half Korean.
Oh,
similar to
great.
Linda,
What is
so- Yeah, it's Sebok Mani Badoseo.
Whoa, yes, that sounds official. And he said it in a polite way. 감사합니다.
This is great. What an inspiring evening. And I just want to thank Shirley, Liz, Tram, Bina, and Linda for your authentic sharing, your insights, and your wise counsel and advice. I couldn't think of a better way to spend an evening. And I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to these trailblazers among us tonight. Helen Chin Shitley, Aunt Helen, Professor Rosabeth Cantor, Dr. Priscilla Douglas, and Carmen Ortiz. They were all here listening to us. And I want to say a shout out to Quincy Miller, the president of Eastern Bank, and Nancy Stager, the president of the Eastern Bank Foundation. And they are a founding corporate partner of Get Connected. So thank you all for being here. And we will be back with our Black History Month, Legends, Trailblazers, and Pioneers. So that will be on the 23rd of February. And Gong Hei Fat Choi.
And thank you, Colette, and the entire Get Connected team. This is fabulous. And thank you, everybody who, with great questions and your involvement, we just couldn't do it without you. Love those questions.